The more disciplined you become, the stranger people act around you. Not openly hostile, not confrontational, but quietly uncomfortable, dismissive, and distant. And most people assume they did something wrong, that they offended someone, that they changed too much. But the silent samurai understood something most never will. Discipline is not neutral, it is confronting, because discipline is a mirror, and mirrors do not argue, they reflect. And when you wake up early while others sleep, when you train while others scroll, when you stay consistent while others restart every Monday, you are not judging anyone, but your behavior reflects values, and values expose choices, and that is where discomfort begins. Because consistency exposes inconsistency without a single word spoken, and the human mind compares automatically, not because it wants to grow, but because it wants relief from guilt. And when someone sees you honoring commitments you made to yourself, it reminds them of promises they broke quietly, goals they abandoned without closure. And discipline becomes evidence, not of superiority, but of accountability. And accountability threatens comfort. So resentment forms silently. Because most people do not hate loudly. Open hatred requires courage. It requires ownership of emotion. And courage is already what discipline exposed they lack. So instead of confrontation, people choose passive resistance, because quiet resentment feels safer than honest self-reflection. It avoids accountability. And this is why the first reaction to discipline is rarely admiration, it is silent comparison. They measure themselves against you without asking. They feel inadequate without admitting it, and instead of rising, they withdraw emotionally. Conversations shorten, energy shifts, enthusiasm fades, and then comes minimization, not as an attack, but as a defense. Phrases like, "you're doing too much," or "life's about balance," surface, not as wisdom, but as disguised insecurity. Because if discipline is excessive, then their lack of it feels justified. And when minimization fails to restore comfort, subtle sabotage appears. Support goes missing at key moments. Humor turns sharp. Encouragement becomes discouragement disguised as concern. And all of this happens quietly, because silence allows them to protect their self-image without risking exposure. And then comes projection, the most revealing stage, where calm confidence is misread as arrogance, where your refusal to complain becomes thinking you're better, not because you said anything, but because ego needs an enemy to survive reflection. And finally, emotional distance settles in, less warmth, less curiosity, less celebration of your progress, a quiet rejection that feels confusing if you don't understand the mechanism. But the silent samurai understood this pattern centuries ago. Warriors accepted isolation as the cost of excellence. They knew strength lived quietly attracts resistance, not applause. Because discipline disrupts emotional equilibrium. It raises a question others are unwilling to answer. Why not me? And when that question cannot be faced, resentment is redirected outward. And this is where most people fail. They shrink to fit in. They soften their discipline to regain warmth. They explain themselves to ease others' discomfort. They dilute consistency so they can belong again. But in doing so, they trade self-respect for temporary approval. And the silent samurai never makes that trade, because he knows discipline is not a performance. It does not exist to be understood. And the moment you start explaining why you are consistent, you are already seeking permission. And permission is the enemy of mastery. Because discipline does not need consensus, it needs continuity. And every time you compromise consistency to comfort someone else's insecurity, you reinforce the very weakness that resents you. And this is why discipline creates emotional imbalance in relationships, not because it harms others, but because it reveals misalignment, and misalignment is painful when ignored. And the silent samurai never absorbs resentment that does not belong to him. He recognizes it as reflection, not accusation. He lets it pass without reaction, because reacting feeds the narrative that discipline is arrogance, and silence starves it. And as time moves forward, something subtle but inevitable happens. Results compound, habits solidify, identity hardens, and those who quietly resisted either drift away or return with a different tone. Because silence wins battles words cannot, and discipline outlasts criticism, not by force, but by inevitability. And the first test of strength is enduring the quiet discomfort of being misunderstood without flinching. The silent samurai responds to quiet resentment not with explanation, not with defense, not with performance, but with rules, simple, immovable rules that protect his path. And the first rule is consistency without commentary. No justification, no storytelling, no need to be seen, because discipline that needs validation is still negotiating with doubt. And the samurai does not negotiate with weakness, especially not someone else's. And the second rule is emotional detachment from resentment, because resentment is never owned by the disciplined, it is projected by the undisciplined, and absorbing it transfers responsibility that was never yours. So he lets it pass like wind through armor, felt but not carried. And the third rule is reduced emotional exposure. Share less, build quietly, protect energy. Because not everyone deserves access to your process, and premature visibility invites premature judgment, and judgment drains momentum, and the samurai knows that energy is currency, and wasted currency never compounds. And the fourth rule is patience, letting time do what words cannot, because results speak in a language resentment cannot interrupt. And when consistency compounds long enough, resistance either transforms into respect or disappears entirely. And this is where stoic alignment becomes unavoidable. Be tolerant with others, strict with yourself. Because discipline is not punishment, it is freedom. It frees you from emotional dependency, from social volatility, from the need to be understood. And each act of discipline reinforces the inner citadel, a place no external resentment can breach. And this is why discipline feels lonely at first, not because it isolates you forever, but because it temporarily separates intention from action. It exposes who is serious and who is symbolic, and most people live symbolically, talking about change, admiring progress from a distance, mistaking intention for identity, while the samurai lives operationally, measured not by what he plans, but by what he repeats. And repetition is threatening to those who rely on motivation, because motivation fluctuates, discipline remains. And when resentment appears quietly, it is not a signal to stop, it is confirmation that the path is demanding enough to filter illusions. And the samurai does not comfort those who resist growth, not out of cruelty, but out of respect for reality, because growth does not negotiate, it selects, and discipline selects by endurance, not charisma. And as the series closes, the truth sharpens. Discipline does not make people hate you, it makes them confront themselves. And those unwilling to face that confrontation will always minimize, project, withdraw, or sabotage, quietly. Because silence hides fear better than aggression ever could. And your responsibility was never to be liked for your discipline. It was to honor the discipline that gave you clarity, strength, and self-respect. Because self-respect is built when you do what you said you would do long after the mood disappears. And once that respect is internal, external approval loses power.
And when approval loses power, resentment loses leverage. And eventually, without announcement, without explanation, without confrontation, the atmosphere shifts. People either rise or fade, and neither outcome requires your involvement, because the silent samurai stands without permission, moves without announcement, and wins without argument. And in the end, discipline does not isolate you permanently. It isolates you until your strength is undeniable. And once it is, respect replaces resentment quietly, exactly the way resentment once arrived, without a single word spoken.
There comes a phase in discipline that very few people talk about, not because it is rare, but because it is uncomfortable to admit. And that phase is when your discipline stops being invisible and starts changing the emotional temperature of every room you enter. Not loudly, not dramatically, but subtly, like a pressure shift people can feel but cannot explain. And at this stage, you realize something unsettling. Your discipline is no longer just a personal practice, it has become a silent standard. And standards make people uneasy because they remove excuses without confrontation. And the silent samurai recognizes this moment instantly, because this is where discipline stops being admired privately and starts being resisted quietly. And this is why the resentment becomes more refined, more passive, more polite on the surface, but heavier underneath. Because people have learned that attacking discipline directly makes them look weak. So instead, they question your humanity, your balance, your motives, your joy, anything except the truth, which is that your consistency has outgrown their comfort. And at this stage, the samurai must make a decision that determines whether he becomes exceptional or returns to average. He must decide whether he will remain loyal to the discipline that shaped him or loyal to the social comfort that shaped nothing. And most people fail here, not because they lack strength, but because they misunderstand the cost. They think the price of discipline is effort, time, sacrifice, but the real price is emotional independence, the willingness to be misunderstood without rushing to correct the misunderstanding, because correction is often just another form of seeking approval, and approval is the currency of the undisciplined, and the samurai does not spend what he no longer values. So instead of explaining, he observes. Instead of defending, he continues. Instead of reacting, he withdraws his emotional availability, not out of bitterness, but out of clarity. Because clarity teaches you that not everyone who smiles deserves access, not everyone who questions deserves answers, and not everyone who resents deserves reassurance. And this is where discipline evolves from habit into identity. Because identity does not ask for permission, it does not negotiate with moods, and it does not collapse under quiet pressure. And this evolution is why the isolation deepens before it resolves. Because discipline strips away relational illusions, it reveals who connected to you through convenience and who aligned with you through values. And this separation feels like loss if you are still attached to being liked, but it feels like relief once you realize how much energy you were leaking to maintain emotional harmony with people who were never aligned with your direction. And the samurai understands that alignment matters more than approval, because approval fades the moment you stop performing, but alignment endures even in silence. And this is why he no longer announces goals, no longer explains routines, no longer softens edges to appear relatable, because relatability is often just shared stagnation dressed as connection, and stagnation is contagious if you linger long enough. And the disciplined know this intuitively, which is why they build quietly, train early, leave rooms early, speak less, and let outcomes speak later. And as this quiet building continues, something paradoxical happens. The very people who once resented your discipline begin to recalibrate their perception, not because you convinced them, but because time forced comparison again. And this time, the comparison is not potential versus intention, it is results versus excuses. And excuses do not age well, they rot quietly. And when they rot long enough, the smell reaches the same people who once defended them.
And this is when respect begins to replace resentment. Not admiration, not praise, but a quieter form of acknowledgement, the kind that shows up as fewer comments, fewer jokes, fewer questions about why you do what you do, because they finally understand it is not a phase, and phases can be waited out, but identities cannot. And the silent samurai never rushes this moment, because rushing implies need, and need weakens authority. So he lets time do what ego cannot. He lets silence create distance, distance create perspective, and perspective create acceptance. And some will return differently, humbler, calmer, less defensive, and others will disappear entirely. And neither outcome requires explanation, because discipline never existed to keep everyone close. It existed to keep you aligned, and alignment demands pruning, always has, always will. And this is why the silent samurai does not mourn the quiet exits. He understands them as part of the process, because growth without loss is illusion, and strength without solitude is performance. And in the end, discipline reveals something deeper than work ethic or control. It reveals your relationship with discomfort, because discipline is choosing discomfort now over regret later, while resentment is choosing comfort now over accountability forever. And those two paths cannot walk side by side indefinitely. They diverge, silently, inevitably. And when you finally see that divergence clearly, you stop wondering why people changed around you. You understand that nothing broke, something clarified, and clarity always feels lonely before it feels powerful. And the silent samurai accepts this loneliness without resentment of his own, because he knows it is temporary, not because people will change, but because he will stop needing their reaction to validate his direction. And once that need dissolves, freedom arrives, quiet, steady, unannounced. And at that point, discipline stops being something you practice and becomes something you are. And when that happens, resentment no longer reaches you, because it no longer knows where you live.
There is a final stage of discipline that very few people ever reach, not because it is physically demanding, but because it requires a level of psychological honesty that most people spend their lives avoiding. And that stage is when you fully accept that your discipline will permanently alter how people relate to you, not temporarily, not during a phase, but fundamentally. Because once discipline hardens into identity, you are no longer participating in the same emotional economy as everyone else. You are no longer trading validation for belonging, excuses for sympathy, or intention for identity. And this shift is subtle at first, almost invisible, but over time it becomes unmistakable. And this is where resentment, which once appeared as discomfort or distance, transforms into something quieter and more structural, an unspoken reclassification of who you are in the minds of others. Because disciplined people are difficult to categorize. They are not rebellious enough to be admired for chaos, not compliant enough to be embraced for sameness, and not needy enough to be emotionally manageable. And this ambiguity unsettles people who rely on predictable social roles to feel safe, because discipline removes leverage, and leverage is how most relationships unconsciously operate, through shared weakness, shared indulgence, shared complaints, shared procrastination. And when you quietly remove yourself from those shared behaviors, you do not just leave habits behind, you leave contracts behind. Contracts that were never written but always enforced. And when those contracts are broken without confrontation, people do not respond with clarity, they respond with confusion. And confusion often masquerades as resentment, because resentment is easier than admitting that a relationship was built on mutual avoidance rather than mutual growth. And the silent samurai sees this clearly, which is why he does not romanticize isolation nor resent it. He understands it as a structural consequence of alignment, because alignment always disrupts systems built on compromise, and most social systems are exactly that, compromise machines, designed to minimize discomfort rather than maximize truth. And discipline introduces truth through behavior, not argument, and truth delivered without invitation feels aggressive to those invested in illusion. so they soften it with labels, calling you extreme, obsessed, disconnected, rigid, boring, or arrogant. Not because those labels are accurate, but because labels reduce threat. They turn a mirror into a caricature, something small enough to dismiss. And at this stage, many disciplined people make a fatal mistake. They try to prove they are still relatable, still warm, still flexible, still human, as if discipline stripped them of humanity. But the samurai never makes this mistake, because he knows that humanity is not proven through indulgence, it is proven through restraint, through the ability to choose long-term integrity over short-term relief. And this is why he becomes quieter as discipline deepens. Not colder, not harsher, but more selective. Because selectivity is not rejection, it is respect for finite energy. And energy is the true resource discipline teaches you to protect. Not time, not motivation, but emotional energy. The energy drained by unnecessary explanations, by defending choices that require no defense, by absorbing moods that were never yours to manage. And once you stop bleeding that energy, something profound happens. Your presence changes. You stop broadcasting effort and start emitting stability. And stability is intimidating to people who live in cycles of urgency, chaos, and emotional volatility. Because stability offers no hooks, no drama, no reassurance, no excuses. And without those hooks, they cannot anchor their insecurities. So they drift, quietly. And this drifting is often misinterpreted as abandonment, but it is not abandonment. It is misalignment correcting itself. And correction always feels like loss to those who benefited from imbalance. And this is where the samurai's discipline becomes internally tested, not by temptation, but by loneliness. Not the loud loneliness of isolation, but the quiet loneliness of being surrounded yet not mirrored, understood yet not followed, respected yet not embraced. And this is where discipline transcends habit and becomes philosophy. Because philosophy is what sustains you when rewards are delayed and affirmation is absent. And the samurai's philosophy is simple but ruthless. He does not need to be understood to be correct. He does not need to be included to be whole. And he does not need to be liked to be aligned. And this understanding removes the last emotional dependency most people never even realize they have, the dependency on shared reality, the need for others to validate not just your actions, but your interpretation of life itself. And once that dependency dissolves, resentment loses its final weapon, because resentment feeds on reaction, and the samurai offers none, not because he is suppressing emotion, but because there is nothing left to defend. And at this stage, discipline becomes quiet power, the kind that does not announce itself, does not posture, does not demand recognition, but subtly reorganizes the social landscape around it. Because people respond differently to those who no longer negotiate their standards. Some step up unconsciously, tightening their own habits, sharpening their own routines, inspired but silent, while others retreat further into comfort because proximity to discipline makes avoidance unbearable. And both outcomes are acceptable to the samurai, because his responsibility was never to drag others forward, it was to walk his path cleanly enough that those who were ready could follow without being pulled. And this is why discipline ultimately reframes resentment entirely. It stops being something you endure and becomes something you expect, not pessimistically, but realistically. Because any deviation from the average creates friction, and discipline is deviation sustained over time, and sustained deviation rewrites identity, and rewritten identity destabilizes social equilibrium, and equilibrium always fights back before it resets, quietly, indirectly, politely, but persistently. And the samurai does not misinterpret this resistance as hostility. He understands it as pressure equalizing, systems recalibrating, reality adjusting to a new constant. And this is why he never rushes outcomes, never forces respect, never corrects misconceptions prematurely, because time is the only force strong enough to settle perception without argument. And as years pass,
Not days, not weeks, years, something inevitable occurs. The same people who once felt unsettled by your discipline begin to reference you differently. Not publicly, not dramatically, but privately, as a standard, as an example, as someone who always stayed consistent. And this recognition does not come with apologies, it comes with silence, because pride rarely apologizes, but silence is still acknowledgement. And the samurai accepts it without satisfaction or resentment, because satisfaction would imply need, and resentment would imply attachment, and he has neither. And this is the final liberation discipline offers: freedom from emotional reactivity, freedom from social volatility, freedom from the need to be mirrored. And once you reach this point, you no longer ask why discipline makes people uncomfortable. You understand that discomfort was never about you. It was about the friction between who they are and who they promised themselves they would become. And your discipline simply refused to participate in the lie. And that refusal is the quietest, cleanest form of power there is, because it does not attack, it does not persuade, it does not demand, it simply exists. And existence at that level is enough to expose everything false around it. And this is why discipline does not isolate you forever. It isolates you until your identity is solid enough to stand without reflection. And once you can stand alone without bitterness, without explanation, without performance, you are no longer isolated, you are sovereign. And sovereignty is something resentment cannot touch, because resentment requires access, and discipline has quietly, permanently closed the door.
Bruce Lee's water philosophy reached its most advanced level near the end of his life, a level most people have never even heard of, a level where water thinking wasn't just about adaptability or resilience, but about mastery over the unseen forces that shape human behavior, identity, decisions, and destiny. And in Part 4, we dive into the psychological, emotional, and strategic layers Bruce uncovered as he evolved into the most fluid human being of his generation. To understand this deeper dimension, imagine Bruce not as a fighter or actor, but as a scientist studying reality through the lens of movement, emotions, energy, rhythm, timing, and human nature. He wasn't just observing water, he was observing life itself. And he began realizing a truth hidden from the average person. Most people don't fail because they're weak. They fail because they resist the natural flow of life. They cling to what should be instead of responding to what is. They chase control instead of mastering adaptability. They drown in overthinking rather than learning to move with instinct. Bruce recognized that overthinking is like debris in a river. It slows the flow, clogs the path, and creates resistance. That's why he said, if you spend too much time thinking about a thing, you'll never get it done. Water doesn't overthink. It moves, feels, senses, responds. Bruce realized that instinct, not analysis, is what keeps you alive in chaos. This was the foundation of his famous non-intention principle. In combat, he didn't plan 3 steps ahead like a chess player. He emptied his mind, became fully present, and allowed instinct to guide his movements. Modern neuroscience calls this state flow, where the brain shuts down the prefrontal cortex, the overthinking part, and activates deeper layers responsible for intuition, speed, and reaction. In flow, athletes react faster than their conscious mind could ever think. Fighters strike before they realize they struck. Creators produce ideas they didn't know existed. Bruce was living in flow long before psychology identified it. Water is always in flow. Bruce trained himself to live there. But here's the deeper truth he discovered. Instinct only becomes reliable when the ego gets out of the way. Ego is the rock that blocks the river. Ego makes you rigid. Ego makes you defensive. Ego makes you cling to identities, opinions, and fears. Bruce understood that ego kills adaptability, and adaptability is strength. That's why he warned, the ego is the enemy of the flexible mind. He believed that the highest level of mastery is ego death, becoming so fluid that you no longer cling to appearing right, strong, superior, or perfect. People today crumble under pressure because their ego is fragile. They take criticism personally. They react emotionally. They cling to labels. They fear rejection. They collapse when their identity is threatened. Bruce's solution? Become formless in your identity. Don't be attached to being the smartest, the strongest, the most talented, the fastest, the chosen one. Be attached only to growth. Water doesn't care what shape it takes. It only cares about movement. This is why Bruce said, "I am not in this world to live up to your expectations, and you are not in this world to live up to mine." This wasn't rebellion, it was freedom. But the next level of his water philosophy wasn't emotional or mental, it was energetic. Bruce believed that life has a rhythm, an invisible flow that only a few people learn to sense. When he sparred, he didn't just watch his opponent's body, he watched the rhythm of their breathing, the pace of their steps, the timing of their tension. He found the gaps, the openings, the micro moments of imbalance. This is water intelligence. When a wave retreats, it creates a vacuum, an opening. When a river changes speed, it reveals a weak point. Bruce applied this in life. He sensed momentum. He sensed timing. He sensed when to push and when to wait. Today's world is filled with people who fail because they push when they should wait or wait when they should act. They force progress instead of sensing openings. They waste energy fighting timing instead of flowing with it. Bruce understood that life is not one with constant force. It's one with strategic timing. Water doesn't force itself upstream, it waits for gravity to assist. This is why Bruce's success looked sudden, but it was actually perfectly timed. When Hollywood needed someone who could capture global audiences, Bruce was ready. When Hong Kong cinema needed a new face, Bruce had the skills. When martial arts needed evolution, Bruce had the philosophy. He was not early, he was not late, he was water, perfectly timed. But Part 4 goes even deeper into his private notes, where Bruce described what he called the flow of truth, his most advanced insight. He believed that every person faces three internal battles: the battle with fear, the battle with doubt, and the battle with inner conflict. And the only way to win those battles is to become emotionally fluid. Fear is rigid, water dissolves it. Doubt is heavy, water washes it. Conflict is chaotic, water steadies it. Bruce wrote, "To know oneself is to study oneself in action with another person." Meaning, you don't discover your true self in quiet moments, you discover it under pressure. When you're angry, your real emotions appear. When you're scared, your real instincts appear. When you're challenged, your real beliefs appear. Water reveals truth because it reacts naturally, not artificially. That's why Bruce believed honesty with oneself was the foundation of power. Most people lie to themselves every day. They tell themselves they're fine when they're drowning. They tell themselves they're trying when they're barely moving. They tell themselves they're patient when they're avoiding action. They tell themselves they're in control when their emotions control them. Bruce's notes say, "Be realistic, don't delude yourself." He believed you cannot change what you cannot see. Honesty is the light that reveals the path. Water cannot be polluted if it constantly flows. People become polluted when they stagnate in denial. But the most advanced layer of his philosophy wasn't about fighting or overcoming, it was about creation. Bruce believed water thinking could help you create a life unique to you, unrestricted by society, expectations, or tradition. He wrote, "The function and duty of a human being is the sincere and honest exploration of oneself." That means your life shouldn't imitate, it should originate. Water never copies rivers, it creates new ones. Bruce didn't want you to become him, he wanted you to become you. Not the version shaped by pressure, not the version defined by trauma, not the version limited by fear. The version created through fluid evolution. Bruce believed your highest potential is not found by following a path, but by flowing into your own path. That is the ultimate water principle, self-creation. You are not meant to live someone else's script. You are meant to write your own. You are not meant to follow the path. They paved it for themselves. You are meant to flow through life and carve your own river. In the end, Bruce's deepest message was never "be like me." It was always "be like water so you can become yourself." Because water doesn't imitate, water creates, water transforms, water endures. Water becomes exactly what it needs to become in order to move forward. And that is your destiny too. Every obstacle you face is not a wall. It is a container inviting you to shift shape. Every failure is not the end. It is a new direction calling you. Every moment of pain is not punishment. It is the pressure that builds your next breakthrough. You will not survive life by being strong. You will survive it by being fluid. You will not win by being rigid. You will win by adapting. You will not succeed by resisting change. You will succeed by flowing with it. That is the waterway. That is the Bruce Lee way. And if you truly understand this, there is nothing left in your life that can break you, because you no longer meet challenges as a rock. You meet them as the river that carves mountains.
Bruce Lee's water philosophy reached its final evolution in the last years of his life, a stage where he understood something most people spend their entire lives searching for: the realization that true power does not come from strength, speed, intelligence, or talent, but from alignment. Alignment between who you are, how you think, and how you move through the world. In this final part, we explore the last and deepest layer of Bruce Lee's philosophy, where water becomes not just a metaphor, but a complete operating system for the human mind. To truly understand this, imagine for a moment that you are holding a cup of water. You turn the cup, and the water shifts effortlessly without hesitation. You tap the side, and the water absorbs the shock. You pour it out, and it takes a new shape instantly. Bruce realized that humans are born with this exact natural fluidity, but life conditions us to rigidity. Schools teach us to obey instead of question. Society pressures us to fit instead of explore. Careers demand that we adapt to roles instead of roles adapting to us. People begin to move like rocks, heavy, rigid, predictable, until they forget they were ever meant to be water. Bruce resisted that conditioning with every part of his being. He refused to live a life written by someone else. He refused to be defined by race, tradition, or expectation. He refused to let his identity harden into something that could be broken or controlled. In a world that kept trying to box him in, he dissolved every box. That is why his final and most powerful insight was this: all fixed set patterns are incapable of adaptability or pliability. The truth is outside of all fixed patterns. That one sentence is the key to breaking every mental prison in your life. Think about how many people suffer because they cling to fixed patterns. This is just who I am. This is just how life works. This is my fate. This is my limit. This is how society sees me. Bruce believed those statements were mental cages. Water has no fixed pattern. It adapts, evolves, transforms continuously, and so can you. That's why Bruce wasn't just a fighter. He was becoming a new kind of human being. He lived as if his mind was a river in constant refinement. Every day, he removed what no longer served him. Every day, he questioned assumptions. Every day, he dissolved illusions. And through this process, he discovered the final secret of the water philosophy: freedom. Freedom from fear, freedom from judgment, freedom from the past, freedom from identity, freedom from everything that makes the average person feel small. But this freedom did not come easily. It took Bruce confronting his deepest insecurities. Shannon Lee wrote that behind his confidence, Bruce carried a fear most people never knew about: the fear of dying before becoming fully himself. Not fear of physical death, but fear of an unlived life. That fear is what pushed him to evolve constantly. It made him never settle. It made him reject mediocrity. It made him choose growth over comfort, expression over conformity, truth over approval. Bruce believed that water thinking was the antidote to an unlived life, because water never tries to fit. It flows until it finds what fits. Water doesn't ask permission, it creates its own space. Water doesn't seek validation, it simply exists and moves. Bruce understood that once you embrace this philosophy, life stops being something you endure and becomes something you shape.
But here's the profound realization he reached near the end of his journey. Water is not just adaptable outwardly, it transforms inwardly. When heated, it becomes vapor and rises. When cooled, it becomes ice and strengthens. When broken apart, it becomes mist and expands. No matter how it changes, it remains water. That's identity without attachment, fluid but true. Bruce believed human beings could reach this state where you evolve endlessly while remaining rooted in your essence. This is why he said, what you habitually think largely determines what you will ultimately become. Because your thoughts are the temperature that shape your internal water. Negative beliefs freeze you. Fear evaporates you. Truth balances you. This understanding brought Bruce to his most advanced insight. Alignment is invincibility. When your thoughts, emotions, actions, and purpose move in one unified flow, you become unstoppable. Water never moves in conflict with itself. Every drop moves in harmony. That's the state Bruce lived in, and that's the state anyone can train. But to reach it, he believed you must face the ultimate obstacle, the ego that constantly pulls you away from truth. And here is where he gave humanity one of its most profound teachings. To become water, you must first empty the cup. Empty the limiting beliefs. Empty the emotional baggage. Empty the judgments. Empty the lies you tell yourself. Empty the identities you cling to. Only then can you flow. Only then can you evolve. Only then can you become the highest version of yourself. And now, with everything we've explored, the adaptability, the resilience, the instinct, the emotional fluidity, the timing, the ego dissolution, the self-creation, we arrive at the final stage, the ultimate truth of Bruce Lee's philosophy. Water is freedom. Water is power. Water is truth. But most importantly, water is you. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. You are water in physical form, emotional form, psychological form. Life didn't design you to be rigid. It designed you to adapt. It designed you to evolve. It designed you to move. You were never meant to break. You were meant to flow. And this brings us to the final conclusion, the message Bruce left behind for every person who feels stuck, scared, lost, or uncertain about their path. The world will try to make you hard, rigid, predictable, breakable, but that is not who you are. You are water, born to move, born to adapt, born to reshape everything that stands between you and the life you're meant to live. And the moment you stop resisting and start flowing, you become something the world cannot defeat, cannot contain, cannot limit. The river does not fear the mountain, it carves through it. The wave does not fear the rock, it crashes past it. The ocean does not fear the storm, it becomes it. So whatever you face next, fear, failure, rejection, uncertainty, don't become smaller, don't become harder, don't become the rock that shatters under pressure. Instead, become the river that bends, the tide that rises, the wave that returns again and again until the obstacle breaks. Because the goal of life is not to be unbreakable by resisting, but to be unbreakable by becoming forever adaptable, permanently evolving, endlessly flowing. Bruce Lee understood this at the deepest level, and now you do too. So stop being the rock that life pushes around and start being the water that reshapes the world. Because once you become water, nothing can stop you, nothing can limit you, and nothing can break you ever again.